Welcome back. Last time we began the study of the apologists, but before we get back to looking at more of the apologists, we're going to take a short look at the subject of persecutions in the early church. In order to really understand what it is the apologists were dealing with and why they were writing their apologies as they went along, it really is kind of important for us to know what the early church was facing in the way of persecution. And so we're going to look at that in this particular lecture. What we're going to look at are several slides, several parts of this lecture. We'll consider the causes of persecution. The bulk of what we'll be looking at in this lecture are the series of persecutions that were instituted by or under during the time of several Roman emperors. Sometimes those emperors initiated the persecution, sometimes they were just the emperor in charge when the persecution was taking place. And then we'll conclude with some results of the persecution in terms of its effect on the church. So let me turn to the persecutions, and as I said, we will begin by looking at some of the causes of the persecution first. The causes of the persecution were, and we've seen this already by looking at some of the apologists, so some of this will be a little bit of a review. But persecution was an unhappy reality for the church from its very beginning. We know that from the book of Acts, and again, we could start our study of the persecutions in the book of Acts with the apostles facing the Sanhedrin, of course, the martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, and other instances of the persecution of the early church, up to and including Paul's arrest and his so-called fourth missionary journey, which was really his trip to Rome. And we know a little bit more about Paul's experiences after that, as well as the other apostles, in particular Peter, and we'll have cause to mention both of them again momentarily. But we really want to talk about the persecutions that came at the end of and after the first century into the second and through the third century. The causes of persecution. First, the central cause of persecution, and we've already noted this in an earlier lecture on the early apologists. The basic reason for the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire was the refusal of the church to engage in either pagan worship or in emperor worship. Now, we think of those as more religious terms, and of course, in one very important sense, they were religious activities. But as we've already seen, the purpose many times of these types of pagan worship of all the gods, particularly the so-called emperor worship, was more civic and political than it was religious, or at least it was as much those other things as it was religious. The Roman government believed that with equal conviction that the prosperity in the economy and peace at home and victory on all frontiers all flowed from the state and its gods. So for them to refuse to worship the gods, or to refuse to worship the emperor for that matter, was to invite displeasure and vengeance. The result of this conviction, as a result of this conviction, the Romans accused the Christians of being atheoi, and we've already seen a little bit of this. Not that they were atheists, because they obviously believed in one God, and they believed Jesus was the Son of God. But for them, if you didn't believe in all the gods, then you were an atheoi. You were something of an atheist. In addition to the basic charge that Christians were atheists, was the charge they were haters of mankind. Now, this charge was supported by a long list of specific accusations, and such as many Christians refused service in the army. They would not fight for the glory of Rome or for anyone else, for that matter. They would participate in the government because the government was, again, basically pagan. So again, these civic/religious convictions, you needed to have both in order to serve in the government, and of course they wouldn't serve if it compromised their faith and trust and adherence and belief in devotion to the one true God and Jesus Christ, his Son. They would not attend public spectacles. I think we mentioned this as well in the previous lecture, that Christians wouldn't go to gladiatorial games, and they just found that sort of thing abhorrent. And they even refused to send their children to the local schools. And that's sounding almost too contemporary in one sense, but they didn't want their children to be indoctrinated with a lot of what they were going to get in the pagan school system, so they didn't participate. Christians were said to be guilty of immoral practices in the religious assemblies. Again, I think we touched on this, but they were believed to have eaten human flesh. That seems like a bizarre charge, but you think about the communion services that were rather secretive, and they overheard talk. The pagans would have overheard talk about partaking of Christ's body and blood, and they seemed to think that this included cannibalism, I suppose, in some respects. They accused Christians of becoming drunk and engaging in adultery. And again, the reference to drinking the cup as a part of their communion rites, doing the communion service. I guess some people would get the idea that that happened. And apparently, as Paul dealt with the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, sometimes that must have happened. And they accused them of adultery and particularly incest. And again, these seemed like bizarre, strange charges, but there were those gatherings that were referred to, again, in Acts 2 and in 1 Corinthians 11 as the love feasts, the agape feasts. And so that led some people to make some rather strange, but I guess in some respects understandable charges. And Christians seemed to be basically antisocial, and so there was a great incentive for the pagans around them to come up with accusations, no matter how unsupported or bizarre. Christians were accused then of threatening the safety of the state because of their ecclesiastical organization. Here's this secretive organization inside the empire, inside the social structure, that didn't participate in the social gatherings of the people, again, at the gladiatorial games or other sorts of things. And of course, this makes those kind of secret societies make governments very suspicious and fearful of revolt and or some kind of social disruption, or at least political opposition. And this has been something that governments throughout the history of the world have found, that one of the ways to make sure that you don't foster rebellion is forbid all kinds of associations or secretive societies. In any case, as the result of these accusations, Christians were persecuted, not because of what they did, but simply many times because of what they were. These strange accusations and others could be applied to them without any evidence except on the simple charge that they were Christians. Bearing the name of Christ became sufficient cause for persecution. And persecution, again, as I've said, did happen. So we're going to look, there's going to be a number of slides here now that will just highlight briefly the emperor under which the persecution took place and something of the nature of that persecution. Now you can see that this is fairly early. Claudius was an emperor between 41 and 54 AD, and about 49 or 50, Claudius, this is still during the ministry of the Apostle Paul and Peter and others, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. The cause, according to Roman historian Suetonius, was that, quote, the Jews were continually making disturbances at the instigations of Chrestus. Now, we don't really know too much about this Chrestus, other than there doesn't seem to be anyone who comes close to being identified as Chrestus, except for possibly Jesus Christ. I mean, Romans may have misunderstood that, or Suetonius might not have gotten that right. So, as one author says, this is plausibly a reference to the expulsion of the Jewish Christians from Rome. So the Jews would oppose Christians, and the debate between the Jews and the Jewish Christians would have been over one who is called Christ, or again, in a Romanized sort of form, Chrestus. And we do know that this expulsion took place under Claudius. The book of Acts even mentions this expulsion in Acts 18:2, where it says, there he, that is Paul, met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Prisca, or Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Aquila and Priscilla seem to have been converted prior to meeting Paul, and they would have been among those that were expelled from Rome because of their Christian association. Particularly nasty persecution under a particularly nasty character named Nero happened in the years just after Claudius, in the years Nero reigned from 54 to 68 AD. And many people know this story. This is well known historically. In 64 AD, a great fire swept through the city of Rome, which may or may not have been caused by Emperor Nero, but in any case, he blamed the Christians for it. And because Christians were already something of a reviled group, not well thought of by most Romans, it was easy to put the blame on them. They were arrested and put to death, as one author says, in often a quite spectacular and sadistic fashion. It really was pretty horrible. As another author says, it was during this time that the Apostle Peter, according to tradition, was crucified upside down because he felt himself not worthy to die exactly like his master. And Paul, a Roman citizen, was beheaded under Nero's reign. So this persecution was the time which both of the great apostles, Peter and Paul, were martyred. For the burning of Rome, Christians were arrested and persecuted. As we said, many Christians were crucified. Some were sewn into the skins of wild beasts, and then dogs were let loose on them. They were torn apart by these big dogs. At this time were not household pets. They were scavengers. Women were tied to mad bulls and dragged to death. And after nightfall, Christians were sometimes burned at the stake in Nero's garden. The details there are pretty gruesome, and I'll spare you. The Roman people who hated the Christians were free to come to that garden, and Nero drove around in his chariot, wickedly enjoying the scene. It was just horrific and pretty brutal. The next emperor under whom there was a serious persecution was Domitian. This persecution lasted from about AD 90 to 95, so it's toward the end of his particular reign. It was really caused because the Jews refused to pay a poll tax to the state. And since Rome still considered Christianity at the time to be part of Judaism, they punished the Jews and Christians alike. I'm sure that there were a number of Jewish Christians that were caught up in this retribution on the Jewish rebellion and refusal to pay this poll tax. Some Christians were martyred, some dispossessed of property, others simply banished, and all three of those kinds of persecution were fairly typical. It was at this time that the Apostle John was exiled to the island of Patmos, where he received the vision that was then recorded in the book of the Revelation. Trajan, and his name has come up before, as you're going to remember here in a moment, as another emperor who directly exercised the persecution of the Christians. A particularly revealing picture of the Christians' position in the early 2nd century, usually uneventful and occasionally terrible, but always precarious, emerges from a letter written to the Emperor Trajan by the Roman writer and administrator Pliny the Younger during his tenure as the governor of Bithynia. You can see his dates there in the early 2nd century. In his letter to Trajan, Pliny the Younger asks whether Christians should be punished simply for bearing the name of Christ and for acting upon their faith. He asks Trajan, what should he do about these Christians? He knows that they are we've said it before, a religio illicita. They were an illicit religion and an illegal religion. And so he wants to know what he should do about dealing with them. He explains in his letter that he had used interrogations, torture, and even the threat of death in order to extract information from these Christians in order to exercise the authority of Rome against them. Interestingly enough, Trajan, and you may remember Trajan was the one that sent Ignatius to his martyrdom. Ignatius wrote back to Pliny at this time and said, basically, Pliny, you're doing the right thing. Keep examining them, try to find out about them. So he didn't rebuke him about his particularly harsh methods. He did say, for no hard and fast rule can be laid down to meet a question of such wide extent. So what he's saying there is that you basically have to deal with these Christians on a more or less case-by-case basis. Interestingly, he said, do not hunt them out. Christians are not to be hunted out. But if they're brought before you and their offense is proved, they are to be punished. But basically, the rest of that quotation goes on to say, if there's anyone who denies it or recants, then you can treat him with some leniency, in effect. As I've already said, it was during this time that Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, was thrown to the wild beast in the Colosseum. Like many, Ignatius, in his letters, seems to indicate that he kind of longed for the honor of giving his life to his Savior. There may have been an unhealthy desire for martyrdom on the part of some early apologists, or perhaps that's just the information that's come down to us by reports or indications in their writings. And in any case, Ignatius is said to have said these words, "May the wild beasts be eager to rush upon me, and if they are unwilling, I will compel them. Come, crowds of wild beasts, come, tearings and manglings, racking of bones, hacking of limbs. Come, cruel tortures of the devil, only let me attain to Christ." Now, this may, again, be interpreted as a desire for martyrdom, or maybe just recognizing that he's going to have to deal with some pretty gruesome eventualities in order to maintain his testimony. So, again, we're just talking about the fact that this is the kind of thing that the persecutors would have brought. They would have brought wild beasts. They would have brought a rather horrific type of martyrdom to some of the early Christian martyrs. In the 2nd century now, we're moving ahead a little bit here, persecutions took place under Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, many might know that Marcus Aurelius was as much a philosopher as he was an emperor. He was an adherent of Stoicism and wrote some books of philosophy, of the Stoic philosophy. But he was an intolerant Stoic, and he really had no love for the Christians at all, and he actually disdained them when many people admired Christians for maintaining their faith up and through martyrdom. He thought that was silly. It bordered on the theatrical, he thought. And again, this is all part of his Stoicism. If your philosophy leads you to something like that, it's not a good philosophy as far as he was concerned. And so he didn't give much credit to Christians who would allow themselves to be martyred for their faith. He introduced a spy system against Christians and promised that the property of the Christians would be given to their accusers. And that's a good way to sort of set one part of the populace against another. And many Christians were turned over to authorities, and persecution became almost universal. And by all accounts, the persecution under Marcus Aurelius was pretty cruel. Maybe not to the level that was displayed under Nero, who was something of a madman, but nevertheless, it was intended to try and prevent people from becoming Christians. It was during this time that Justin Martyr, we're going to be talking about him coming up, one of the apologists we haven't discussed yet, but it was during the time of Marcus Aurelius that Justin Martyr was martyred. He was scourged, beheaded, and in the face of death, he bore up this testimony, and the tradition is his last words were, "We desire nothing more than to suffer for our Lord Jesus Christ." Again, this may be an indication of their unhealthy desire for martyrdom, or maybe just the sort of, again, faith in the face of dire circumstances. In any case, he says, this gives us salvation and joyfulness before his dreadful judgment seat. In other words, he knew that this martyrdom would be something that the Lord would look favorably on. And probably they're thinking of, again, the biblical martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7 as an example of how to maintain a good testimony during a time of martyrdom. He was also asked, "Do you suppose that you will rise again and live forever?" And Justin's response was, "I don't suppose it, I know it." And that's a pretty good testimony to his confidence in the Lord's promises. Moving ahead again, there was another serious persecution under Emperor Decius. You can see his dates there. Now, again, we've taken a jump there, but of a number of years, at least over half a century. Decius took the imperial throne about the time that Rome was reaching the end of the first millennium of her history. This would have been a time when natural calamities had happened, internal disputes, external attacks had caused some instability in this particular time. And Christianity, because of its rapid growth, was picked out as the major cause of the empire's troubles. Remember, in the previous lecture, we said that in the 2nd century, there was a time of relative peace, and in the empire, this particular era, the 3rd century, moving into the 4th century until the time of Constantine, it was a time of essentially decline. And whenever there's a decline in the social fabric or in the political fortunes of those in power, you look for a scapegoat, and Christianity was looked at often as the scapegoat. And the reason why was because they thought, well, the Christians aren't worshiping the gods, and that's why the gods are angry. So the same logic that has been behind a lot of the persecutions and a lot of why what the early apologists were trying to deal with is something that, again, was still leading to persecution. Decius issued an edict in 250 AD that demanded an annual offering of sacrifice to the Roman altars and gods and to the genius of the emperor. Now you can see this is exactly what we've said already. The church was faced with these kinds of laws, these kinds of edicts, that sacrifices need to be made to the gods and to the emperor. Again, whether they thought the emperor was an actual deity or not is quite beside the point. The point is that you had to make this offering in order to assure the authorities that you weren't a threat to the power structure, to the emperor and all of his bureaucracy. Those who offered the sacrifice, back to the slide here, were given a certificate, libellus, and Christians were demanded to give up their faith and suffer life and property or death if they didn't obtain one of these certificates. Now, what we're going to find out is some Christians bought the certificate without actually offering a sacrifice, or obtained a waiver, we might say, in some fashion or another, and this led to some problems a little later on, we'll see. Nevertheless, this was another very cruel persecution, and this persecution, unlike some of the others that we really talked about that were localized to the city of Rome perhaps, or just for the few years under a particular emperor, this was empire-wide. This was a very serious persecution, and many perished. During this time, many also denied the faith, but many Christians persevered to the end. Unfortunately for the church, this particular persecution only lasted a few years. A few years further on, you can see the dates there, into the early 4th century, there was a persecution under Emperor Diocletian. Now, Diocletian was a strong military leader who came to the throne at the end of a century that was marked by political disorder. We were just talking about that. And so the instability that had arisen was dealt with by Diocletian in fairly strong terms. He decided that only a strong monarchy, a strong rulership could save the empire, and by the way, reestablish its classical culture. So in AD 285, he ended the diarchy of the Principate created by Caesar Augustus in 27 BC. So he changed some fairly long-standing forms of the government. He took over, so that it wasn't a matter of sharing power with the Senate. He had basically dictatorial power. A strong monarchy, he thought, offered the only alternative to chaos. In such a setting, only a strong leader thought there was no place for faiths or groups of people that were hostile to the state or its religion, and Christianity certainly was one of those groups that Diocletian thought threatened his power and his hold over the empire. The first edict in AD 303 ordered the cessation of meetings of Christians, the destruction of church buildings, and the imprisonment of bishops, elders, deacons, and the torture of all who persisted in their testimony of Christ. As well as, and this is, you think all of that was fairly serious, and of course it was, but what caused the long-term problem was the destruction of all the scriptures by fire. They basically, this was nothing less than an attempt to wipe out Christianity altogether. Second edict ordered Christians to sacrifice to the pagan gods upon pain of death if they refused to do so. So this, again, follows that same pattern we've been seeing. The government wanted to create loyalty, or at least submission to the government, by requiring people to worship the way they wanted the people to worship, as well as to honor the emperor and call him Lord. And Christians, of course, knew that there was only one Lord, Jesus Christ, and they refused to do that. The historian Eusebius points out that the prisons became so crowded with Christian leaders and their congregations, there wasn't enough room even for the criminals. And it just shows how far a despotic ruler like this could threaten the culture by releasing criminals, but keeping Christians in prison. Under Diocletian, again, Christians were punished by the loss of property, exile, imprisonment, execution by the sword or wild beast. Some were sent to Roman labor camps where they were worked to death in mines or starved to death. And these persecutions were a determined and systematic effort, as we said, to uproot Christianity completely, to wipe it off the face of the earth. Or as another author says, the motive of this great persecution was the total extinction of Christianity. Of course, it failed spectacularly, and as we're going to see, at the end of those persecutions, there was a very significant transition. We'll see this in an upcoming lecture, because very soon Emperor Constantine, first Christian emperor, is going to not only stop these persecutions, but in the year 315 will actually issue an edict making Christianity legal. All right, to conclude, let's consider the results of these persecutions. We're going to look at the negative and then the positive. Obviously, when you think of the negative implications of these persecutions, beyond the obvious terrible effects of death and deprivation and deprivement of liberties and all that goes along with that, for the church in specific, it created a controversy. During the severe persecutions under Decius and Diocletian, many professing Christians, especially in North Africa, fled persecution or turned over the scriptures to the state. Now, this is where that controversy of allowing the state authorities, turning over the scriptures to the state authorities in order to avoid persecution, comes back to create a problem for the church and its testimony, again, particularly in North Africa. There was a controversy that arose on how to accept the lapsed ones. The lapsed were the ones that denied Christ or denied the faith or turned over other Christians to the authorities or turned over the scriptures to be burned. How do they deal with these people after the persecution's over and these folks want to come back to the church? How are they to be handled? Now, some favored an easy restoration, understanding how severe this persecution was and what a terrible thing to have your life threatened in a horrible way like that. But some, the Novatians, those who had dealt with the persecutions under Decius, and the Donatists, and the Donatists are going to be the ones that will be important. They will become, we'll hear more about them when we talk about the ministry of Augustine in North Africa. The Donatists arose after the persecution under Diocletian. Both of these groups, particularly the Donatists, wanted a pure church, and they simply would not let the deserters back in without being rebaptized. And there's some other dimensions of this problem as well, as we'll see. But they wanted a pure church, and so they didn't want to make it quite so easy for people who had lapsed to come back. So that caused the controversy that, again, we'll look at a little later on. But what were some positive results of persecution? Again, even with the horrific nature of these persecutions, there were some positive outcomes. First, it actually helped to purify the church. If you stop and think about it, that's not too hard to figure out. It cost something to follow Christ in these first 3 centuries of the church. Therefore, people would not become Christians for political, social, or economic reasons. In other words, Christianity is not a simple social arrangement, and it's not that you just want to join this social group called the church and enjoy some nice fellowship and stuff. You didn't do that in a time of persecution. Furthermore, because of this issue with turning over the scriptures, it caused the church to look carefully at the books that they considered to be scriptures. What scriptures were the ones that were the most vital and the ones that would be the most serious in terms of their loss or in terms of losing them to the flames, to the authorities. Which books are the true books? Which books are the true canon? If Christians are going to die for possessing the Holy Scriptures, they want to know what books are the ones that are the inspired books that are worth dying for. And so it was really the time in which the church made its final recognition of the books that were supposed to be and are in the New Testament canon. And surprisingly enough, one of the other effects of persecutions was growth. The more the church was persecuted, the more the evangelical zeal and commitment of those martyrs, the more their confident testimony of their belief in Christ and in their love for Christ, the promise that they were going to go be with Christ, and the promise of the resurrection, their great courage, that had a great effect on many people. And it actually caused the church to grow, surprisingly. The church began with about 500 followers of Christ in Jerusalem. And from the day of Pentecost until about 300 AD, when these most horrific persecutions were taking place, it's estimated that between 5 and 12% of the population of the empire, about 75 million people, were Christians. And that's really very astounding if you stop and think about it. And that's not really disputed. Millions in just a relatively short period of time, 300 years, less than 300 years, 250 years from the time that of the apostles, it indicates that the promise of the Lord that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church were actually coming true. At the minimum, there were 5 million professing Christians, at least those that were willing to face up to these persecutions and deal with the most horrific parts of that. So while many Christians may have been terrified into recanting their beliefs, the faith of other Christians was actually strengthened by their tribulations. In the end, the willingness of Christians to die for Christ won them not only a reputation for stubbornness, but also for their courage, purity of spirit. And as the influential North African Christian theologian and apologist Tertullian of Carthage, and we'll be looking at him in a later lecture, most succinctly expressed it. And this is the quotation you need to know at the end of our study of persecutions. Tertullian said, "The more you mow us down, the more we grow. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And it's really remarkable that is that's not just a wishful sentiment, but historically accurate. Well, we will move on from the discussion of these persecutions to more of the apologists who had to write their apologies than the defense of their faith during these very turbulent years. Before we turn to that, however, there'll be a brief lecture on the subject of church government and the ideas of church government during this particular time. So I'll be seeing you then.